some singly, some in groups. Many who had served and loved the dead king and fought beside him stood for a moment silently at his bedside as they passed. Others who had hoped to be the new king of Britain left without a glance, still muttering angrily amongst themselves. Merlin watched until all were gone. Then he raised the kneeling queen to her feet, and together they stood looking down at the bed. Suddenly Morgan Le Fay spoke harshly from the shadows. "I tell you again, old man, that this shall never be. There is no son but mine, and he alone shall rule Britain." Queen Igraine shivered, but Merlin's eyes were steady as he watched Morgan Le Fay leave, followed by her son. As it neared the feast of Christmas, men began to make their way to the church of St. Paul from all over the land. Nobles and common people alike were flocking to find out who was to be their next king. On Christmas Eve, the town was alive with the clank of arms and the tramp of men as powerful kings, princes and lords arrived with their followers. The narrow streets were crowded with citizens and soldiers, excitedly waiting for the next day. Long before the dawn of Christmas Day, all began to make their way toward the great church, which stood just outside the town amid wide fields. Among those journeying in from outside was a knight named Sir Ector of Morven. His castle and lands were not far off, and he had set out only that morning with his son Sir Kay and Sir Kay's foster brother Arthur. Sir Ector rode silently. He had been a close friend and companion of King Uther, and carried the scars of many a fight with the Saxons. Now as he rode, he thought of those times, and of the dangers awaiting a country without a king. He wondered which of the great lords, who were already quarrelling amongst themselves, would conquer the others and take the crown of Britain for himself. He feared that it would be one not strong enough or brave enough to lead the constant fight against the Saxon menace. Above all, he feared Morgan Le Fay and the dark, silent Mordred, for it was rumoured that they had friends among the Saxon chiefs, and might even ask for their help in winning the kingdom. Sir Ector's thoughts brightened suddenly as he remembered Merlin. He had known the old man for as long as he could remember, and trusted him in all things. If Sir Ector was silent, Sir Kay and Arthur certainly were not. They were excited at the thought of the great day before them, and talked eagerly, stopping only when one challenged the other to a race to a tree along the way. "When this is over," said Sir Kay breathlessly after one such gallop, "I shall join Sir Bedivere's war band against the Saxons. You may come with me if you wish and carry my lance," he said, turning to Arthur. Arthur was unusually silent for a second or two. "I'll carry no man's lance," he said softly, "nor join another man's troop. magnificent sword. Kay shall have a sword after all, thought Arthur. Reaching out, he pulled at the hilt, and the sword slid easily from the anvil. He set off with his prize to search for Sir Kay, and found him anxiously waiting for Arthur. "Where got you this?" he asked in astonishment, as Arthur gave the great sword into his hand. Before Arthur could answer, another voice echoed the question, and Merlin appeared beside them. He took the sword from Sir Kay, then looked at Arthur. "Get you back inside and follow me not," he commanded. With that he disappeared amongst the high grass and shrubs of the churchyard, taking the sword with him. Hardly had the old man disappeared than the great doors of the church swung open before them, and a great throng of knights and noblemen poured out. "Where is Merlin?" they were asking. "It is time to explain. Where is Merlin?" Sir Kay led them to the wizard, who was now standing beneath the ancient yew tree beside the great stone. Arthur saw that the sword was again firmly embedded in the anvil. The crowd pushed and jostled, and a huge circle formed around Merlin and the stone. When the hubbub of excitement ceased, Merlin pointed to some words which were engraved around the base of the stone. He read them out clearly for all to hear. "Whosoever pulls this sword from the stone shall be the rightful King of England." The buzz of excited talk rose again as the lords and princes pushed their way forward to try. As each made his attempt, the noise ceased, only to break forth again as the crowd saw he had failed. Merlin insisted that all the knights there should also make an effort to withdraw the sword, though Sir Ector did so unwillingly. At last all had tried, and the sword was still in the stone. Then Merlin spoke again. "Now, do you try?" he called loudly and clearly, pointing to Arthur, who was standing at the edge of the crowd. There were murmurs and shouts of disapproval, for Arthur was not yet even a knight, and was unknown to most. Some, like Sir Kay, laughed openly. Merlin repeated his command, and Arthur stepped forward. The silence as he lightly gripped the sword turned into a roar of amazement as the sword slid out easily. It was several minutes before Merlin's voice could again be heard, calling for silence above the angry shouts of those who would not believe that the unknown youth who had beaten them could be their next king. "How can this be, Merlin?" shouted King Lot of Orkney angrily. "Aye, what trickery is this?" called King Mark of Cornwall, and the shout was taken up by others. "No trickery, lords," replied Merlin, "but before you learn all, let the same test be performed again at the next 3 feast days, so that none may doubt the issue." It was agreed that they should meet again at 12th day, Candlemas and Easter. 4 trustworthy knights were chosen to guard the stone by twos, and Sir Ector and Sir Bedivere began this duty. At the next 2-day feast days, Arthur was still the only one who could draw the sword from the stone. So when Easter came, the day set for the final test, the crowd was enormous. Only King Mark was no sign. The new king was escorted into the great church, there to be crowned with great ceremony. When this was done, Merlin explained the mystery of the unknown youth who was now King of England. He told how long ago he had discovered a plot to kill the firstborn son of King Uther and Queen Guinevere. Merlin had taken the baby to the king's lifelong friend, Sir Ector, who had brought him up as his own, knowing nothing of his royal birth. Then King Arthur, attended by all his nobles and knights, rode into the town amid great rejoicing, and set about preparing to make his kingdom safe. The Round Table. The new king had much to do in the months since Uther's death. While Britain had no king, the Saxon pirates had become bolder and their raids more frequent. Their long ships were not only landing on beaches all around the coast, they were now sailing far up the rivers and landing their fierce warriors deep in the rich countryside. The Saxons were even starting to settle down, building their own villages and fortifying them. To make matters worse, some of the powerful lords who hated the young king and who had left before his coronation had banded together to try to seize the throne by force. So King Arthur had decided to move his court further to the west, to the fortress town of Camelot, which the Romans had built. From here, it was but 2 days' march on the straight Roman roads to the new Saxon settlements in one direction, and to the lands and castles of the rebel lords in the other direction. Hardly had the move been made than the king received disturbing news from both places. Just as an exhausted rider on a mud-spattered horse was gasping out news of 2 new Saxon landings, a commotion was heard in the courtyard below. A second rider was brought before King Arthur with a message from the neighbouring kingdom of Cameliard. King Leodegrance of Cameliard had been a friend and ally of King Uther, and one of the first to acknowledge Arthur as the new and rightful king of Britain. He now sent for help. Before the rebel lords could attack Arthur, they would have to pass through Cameliard, and their armies were even now gathering on its border. They far outnumbered the armies of King Leodegrance, who was nevertheless making ready to hold them off. King Arthur immediately called a war council to make plans to meet the double threat. One army, led by Sir Bedivere, was to ride south to attack the Saxons spurred on until, from the other side of a hill in front of them, they heard the clash of steel, the whinnying of frightened horses, and the shouts of fighting men. They topped the rise and saw, spread out before them, the battle already joined. The white helmets of the soldiers of King Leodegrance were clearly to be seen, and his army seemed hard pressed. Setting himself at the head of his knights, who were spread out in a long line along the crest of the hill, Arthur ordered his trumpeter to sound the charge. As the first notes of the trumpet cut through the air, Arthur and his army swept downhill in a thunderous charge and crashed into the ranks of the rebels. Right through they rode, turned and rode back again. Sword took the place of lance, and the fighting became fierce and hand to hand, with King Arthur himself always in the thickest of it. Many good knights fell that day, among them old Sir Darwin, boyhood friend of King Uther. He died beside Arthur, fighting for the son, as he had fought for the father. All day long the battle raged until, as the sun set, it seemed as if neither would gain the upper hand. Then suddenly King Arthur found himself face to face with a giant of a man in black armour, mounted on a black horse, and a crimson raven emblazoned on his shield. It was none other than King Pellinore himself, leader of the rebels and a sworn enemy of Arthur ever since the day he first drew the sword from the stone. He recognised Arthur at once, and came at him furiously with a great roar of rage, wielding his mighty two-handed sword. The mass of fighting soldiers parted around them, content to let the issue rest on the contest between these two. It was a contest that looked unequal, for the young king was dwarfed by his huge opponent, but Arthur was light and quick, while Pellinore was tiring fast. Suddenly it was all over. Seeing an opening, Arthur dashed inside the other's mighty swings and ran the rebel king through. As their leader fell dead, King Pellinore's men laid down their weapons. Those of their leaders still alive were brought before Arthur and surrendered their swords to him. He showed mercy to them by sparing their lives, and they in turn swore to serve him in the future. That night there was a great feast at the court of King Leodegrance to celebrate the victory. The rejoicing was complete when news came that Sir Bedivere had completely defeated the Saxons, burnt their towns and driven the survivors into the sea. During this great banquet, King Leodegrance was attended by his daughter, the Princess Guinevere, whom King Arthur thought the most beautiful lady he had ever seen, and Guinevere, for her part, cast many an admiring glance at the handsome young king, whose brave deeds had saved her father's kingdom as well as his own. As he left for Camelot the next morning at the head of his army, Arthur saw a hand wave from a window high in the castle, and caught a glimpse of the same beautiful face. His thoughts were all of Guinevere as he rode, for he had completely lost his heart. On his return he immediately sent Merlin to Cameliard to ask King Leodegrance for his permission to marry his daughter. As Sir Ector the First raised his sword to take the oath, there was a sudden clap of thunder outside, and the hall was plunged into deep darkness. Then light returned, and they were astonished to find that a name written in gold had mysteriously appeared at every seat around the table except one. Above that unnamed seat was written, "No one shall sit here, save he be the world's truest knight." All, even the king, looked to Merlin in their excitement, for he alone seemed calm. "My lord king and noble knights," he said, solemnly, pointing to the strangely named place, "yonder is the seat named Perilous." There was a moment's silence before the old man continued, raised his lance in salute and challenge, before spurring his horse towards the king. They met with a crash that shattered both lances, though neither man was unhorsed. Riding back, they each collected a fresh lance. Again they met, and again, each time with a force that would have unseated a lesser man. "Here is a worthy champion," muttered Sir Kay. "Worthy indeed," replied Sir Owen, wonderingly. "But who is he?" "We shall know soon enough," exclaimed Sir Bedivere excitedly. "See, they now fight on foot, and at sword play the king has no equal, as the traitor Pellinore found to his cost." But here was no Pellinore, but a swordsman as strong and as quick as Arthur himself. The fight raged up and down the arena with mighty blows, dealt on either side. Suddenly, in front of the royal pavilion where Queen Guinevere sat, King Arthur raised his sword above his head. "Enough, enough," he cried breathlessly. "We two are equal matched." A great cheer rang round the ground as the unknown knight raised his sword also. When there was silence again, the king spoke once more. "It is not right that I, the king, should also be champion at arms to my lady the queen. That honour is yours, Sir Knight, and fairly won. But first, I pray you, make yourself known to us." The unknown knight took off his helmet to reveal the handsome face of a young man, no older than the king himself. "Sire," he said, kneeling before King Arthur, "I am Lancelot of the Lake, from your realm in Brittany across the sea." "Why came you here?" inquired the king. "I had heard of your majesty's fellowship of knights," replied Lancelot, "and came here to earn first a knighthood at your hands, and then a place at your round table." "Both have you earned, and well," said the king, touching the kneeling figure on the shoulder with his sword. "Arise, Sir Lancelot of the Lake, and meet now the queen, whose champion at arms you are by right." Sir Lancelot thought that he had never in his life seen anyone more beautiful than Queen Guinevere, as she smiled and placed the champion's sash around his shoulders. He knew in his heart he could never love another, and swore to himself to serve her for as long as he lived. Only two people were aware of the long glance which passed between the fair queen and her handsome young champion. Merlin saw and was troubled, yet he knew not why. Deeper in the crowd, Morgan le Fay too saw Lancelot's love for the queen written on his face. "There," she said in a triumphant whisper to her son Mordred, "there lies our way to bring about the downfall of Arthur." Later that evening, Merlin looked for King Arthur. "He is resting in his tent, for he is weary after the jousting," Sir Bedivere told him. Merlin crossed the tournament field, which was still alive with people, feasting and making merry in the glare of pine torches. "Ah, my old friend," said the king, looking up with a smile as Merlin entered. "You find me mourning another friend, though not so old. See," and Arthur held out his sword to Merlin, "see how my friend from the stone in the churchyard is now so bent and dented stepped into the boat and rowed quickly into the middle of the lake. Leaning out, he gently took the sword and scabbard. At once the arm slid quietly out of sight beneath the water. Arthur showed the sword to Merlin. He wanted to know how it came to be in the lake, but the old man would tell him little. It is called Excalibur. See that you are worthy of it. Guard well the scabbard also, for it has the power to protect from mortal wounds. Turning the sword over and over in his hands, Arthur found writing on either side of the blade. One said, "Keep me," and the other said, "Cast me away." "What does this mean?" asked the king in wonder. "Keep it I shall, but why should I ever cast away so marvellous a sword as this? Only in the hour of your death do you return to this place and give back the sword," explained Merlin. The way back seemed shorter, but even so the first light of dawn was breaking over the towers and turrets of Camelot as Arthur and Merlin again reached the tournament field. Suddenly trumpets sounded from the battlements, and a troop of armed men, led by Sir Kay and Sir Bedivere, clattered across the drawbridge towards them. "We feared for your safety when we found your tent empty, yet your battered sword still there," exclaimed